I thought this would be the perfect opportunity to talk about what happened to Carrie Minor Johnson in Washington, D.C. in 1919. 1919 was a year filled with violent, brutal, barbaric riots, and the agitator were white racists. Mob rule at that time. This country had no problem with mob rule at that time. But anyway, Carrie took it upon herself to protect her and her family because it was a brutal, brutal atmosphere. There were literally white people running through the street, decimating black folks, going into their community as they often did, and decimated their communities and them as a people, right? Carrie wanted to protect herself. Just like think about the atmosphere now, okay? Somebody coming or trying to break into your house, and they're saying I don't even know if he announced himself, but say they did say, they were announcing who they were, detectives, police, what have you, but you have no proof that there is law enforcement that is at your door, right? You wouldn't see no cars swoop up, sirens, nothing. What would you do? And you had the means to protect yourself, meaning you had some hot ones. What would you do? Let's discuss when I get back. Welcome back, everyone. Welcome back. Let's jump into this. Remember Breonna Taylor? They busted into they had the no-knock warrant, busted into their apartment late at night or early in the morning, and her boyfriend thought that he was defending him and his household against intruders. Or that's what I was, that's what I read from the countless articles and media outlets that talked about it. Imagine waking up out of your deep sleep and then just hearing someone bust down your door, and you have the ability to defend yourself, right? You have a firearm. Wouldn't you pull out your firearm, right? So anyway, you can't keep telling me that this country do not have an agenda against black folks. You cannot tell me, you can't even pay me $1 million to believe that this country does not have an issue with black folks when it comes to law enforcement and every damn thing else, right? What irritates me is when I hear 12 arrests. Today, 20 arrests. I'm like, all them effing people out there marching and stomping and doing attacking police officers and National Guards and all you got was 20 people? 20 people? 5? All right, folks, let's get into this content. Carrie Minor Johnson, that was her name. She was accused of unaliving a police officer in 1919. Carrie Minor Johnson, a 17-year-old black American woman, became a cause where black working class celebrated her in Washington when she and her father held off a mob of whites during the riot, then shot and unalived a detective after police officers invaded their home. Now we're about to hear the details of, everything. We're about to hear what led up to it. We're about to hear how this country has a violent, brutal, barbaric history against those called black Americans. But now they're conservative and they're like, oh, hey, we're not going to do that rioting. We're going to be have peaceful protests, folks. We're going to act like we have sense. Law and order, people. That's why they don't like talking about the history in this country when it comes to those called Black Americans, because everything they're trying to shove down our throat, they have violated on so many levels at so many different degrees. Let's go on. Ben and Carrie, and then we'll try to come in and justify it. Ben and Carrie Johnson peered out the second-story window of their brick row house. It was located at 2020 G Street Northwest. On the sidewalk below, dozens of white men clustered around the glowing street lamp, pointing up at them. You know how they try to make people feel like they should be terrified when they see a group of black men standing around? No, you should be terrified when you see a group of angry white men. And what's so crazy is, what are you angry about? This country was literally built up for you. So what are you angry about? Let's go on. Trapped and surrounded, the Johnsons feared for their lives. I don't blame them. It was the night of Monday, July the 21st, 1919, and the city of Washington was engulfed in racial combat. In expectation of trouble, being a 52-year-old Black American man had obtained a .38 caliber revolver. With his 17-year-old daughter, Carrie, he watched the chaotic scene outside where black residents taking refuge on the roofs of their houses were hurling rocks at the gathering whites. I want y'all to listen to this right quick. I just thought about it. Hold on.
In 1919, historians say there were more than 24 race riots around the country, but DC's proved to be different. It's believed to be the only one with more white casualties than blacks, and that may be one of the many reasons it's buried in history.
They're trying to cut off avenues of approach.
Historian Carol Gibbs says the defensive blockade protecting DC's prosperous Black LaDroit Park neighborhood marks the epicenter of Black resistance in the July 19th, 1919 riot. Black military veterans coming back from the war actually were on rooftops.
They were on throwing bricks. They didn't have rifles, then they were or pistols. Then they were throwing bricks.
Weeks leading up to it, the press stoked anger and fears about Black men assaulting white women in DC.
And I have said in a few videos that America comes with this deception of portraying to the world that they are so ashamed, so morbidly ashamed of the dark history in this country when it comes to those called Black Americans and our ancestors, right? But look at the things that they display to us all the time. Look at the slave movies. Look at the things, the movies and TV shows and documentaries they do where they show the most, or talk about the most barbaric, brutal things that happen to us, right? But they're so ashamed of it. And then they take care of they coddle these slave plantations. Why do you celebrate a structure that holds so much dark history for us, right? But when it comes to talking about the instances where we fought back and we were victorious, you don't really hear about them. When they talk about the lynchings that occurred in this country after slavery, do they talk about the few white sheriff officers that actually did their job when they protected Black men and women from being lynched, dragged out of jail cells and being lynched? Check out this video I did called The Attempted Lynching, and he was one sheriff officer who did his job. A Black American musician returning from a late night gig heard someone shout, "Get the niggers!" A flying brick struck a police officer in the head, dropping him to his knees. Gunshots sounded from the houses across the street. A car full of white men came roaring up the alley next to the Johnsons' row house. More gunfire rang out. 2 Metropolitan Police patrolmen approached, and bystanders told them the shots had come from the second floor. The patrolmen sent for reinforcements. Within minutes, 2 army trucks disgorged 24 armed Marines who surrounded the row house, ready for orders. Marines surrounded the house, ready for orders. I was just thinking about how our rights to citizenship has been denied. Ludicrous. It is ludicrous because, as I keep stating, we are the true natives. So our citizenship should have never been questioned. Anyway, and I just, it amazes me how people try to come and attack our standing in this country when they're attacked. Oh, they're gonna come from you, black folks. Yeah, okay. No, you just stay, keep your eyes on your own paper. Stay in your lane. Don't worry about this over here, because they know we are the natives. I'm telling you, this government and white America know we are the natives. But let's go on. James Weldon Johnson, poet, activist, and field secretary of the NAACP, called it the Red Summer, a season of blood in America. From April to November 1919, the United States experienced a rolling series of race wars that might be described as neo-Confederate offensive. 54 years after Appomattox riots broke out in at least 26 cities, lynching spread by year's end. 76 black men would be lynched, and most in a decade. Everywhere the story was the same. White mobs, often encouraged by newspaper attention, mobilized to attack their black American neighbors for crimes real and imagined. The media has never been your friend, black folks. Media or Hollywood. And I did a video on talking about the ingrained racism in Hollywood and cinemas. I did it over a year ago. Check that out. Let's go on. In Washington, mobs of white men led by soldiers and sailors who had recently returned from the Great War in Europe and were living in the Marine barracks on Capitol Hill began attacking people of color on Saturday, July the 19th. Incited by sensationalistic, sometimes false stories about black men and, white women, the soldiers started randomly assaulting men in Southwest, a black neighborhood south of the mall. On Sunday, the attack spread to the downtown area along Pennsylvania Avenue. The underpaid police force stood aside. The mobs were soon joined by women and children shouting encouragement. So there goes that black woman, white woman alliance. Everybody always wants to talk about these fake, false, imagined alliances with us. You even let your children come out there and encourage these men to be violent against people who look like me. Let's go on. Much to the surprise of the whites, black men started fighting back. What'd I tell you? How they start acting when you fight back. They have this mentality like they think we're not supposed to fight back. And like I keep saying, if you check out the videos or do your own, you don't even have to check out my videos. Do your own independent research and see how many slaves fought back. And see how terrified white enslavers were. Okay, let's go on. Much to the surprise of the whites, black men started fighting back. The nation's capital was also home to hundreds of black soldiers who had served in the separate battalion, a logistical support union that drove trucks and supplied kitchens. Others have fought in the all-black 367 and 369 infantry regiments in France. Historian C.R. Gibbs reports that when the city drew a parade for returning veterans in early 1919, these men had been told they could not march. Having served their country only to be snubbed, they were bitter and bitterly determined to defend their rights. You see what I'm talking about? The nerve! These men went and gave their lives, used their bodies again to help defend you. And you told them they could. Oh my God. Where the class action lawsuits just for the y'all let this country get away with a whole lot of stuff, black folks. But then turn around and be pissed off at one another for the smallest thing. Let's go on. They feared that white men were working themselves up for a lynching. For black Americans in Washington, the spectacle of the mob determined to unalive a black man was not so distant memory. Less than 2 years before, a black man had nearly been lynched at Fort Myer across the river in Arlington, Virginia, saved only by the personal intervention of the Virginia governor. At a community meeting in June, black veterans had listened to Osceola McCain, a lieutenant who fought with the 367th Regiment at Oregon. No Negroes anywhere in the United States should ever let a white mob take a black man to lynch him without using all the force possible to prevent it, McCain declared. The only thing with which to meet force is force. Here's the thing. This is another thing I cannot stand to hear people say. Not because I'm pro-violent, but I'm pro-defense. You're not going to sit here and tell me I can't defend myself. Even a dog know they have a right to defend themselves. So, when I hear, I'm not advocating violence. I am not advocating. The people who are committing violence against you advocate violence. They've been advocating violence since they had your ass on the plantations, chained and cutting off your limbs to keep you from escaping to freedom. And you think they don't still have that violence ingrained in their souls, in their mind, in every fiber of their being? Are you kidding me? But I know some of you guys, the little pets, gotta say that. Hey, I just gotta throw that in there. I don't advocate violence, but it's like, don't say it. If you can't sit with your whole chest, stop saying it. It's not advocating violence when you're defending yourself. What, somebody just gonna come up and hit you over the head with a hammer and you just gonna sit there and be like, oh, I'm sorry, what did I do to make you angry? Is that what you're supposed to do? Okay, let's go on. When the white mobs started to rampage down the street, word spread north to U Street. Black men converged at the intersection of 7th Street and Florida Avenue, Northwest, the heart of the black American community. With concealed weapons, they defied white police officers who ordered them to disperse. You see that? Men and women watched from the roofs of nearby buildings, shouting at the police. The Washington Bee, the city's black American weekly newspaper, reported that men on bicycles rolled from house to house, warning colored households who roused themselves to meet the invaders. About 10 blocks south, the Johnson's home on G Street was in a racially mixed neighborhood with a view of the Capitol. A Jewish grocer sold goods on the corner, and black American lawyer plied his trade down the street. Ben Johnson, for his part, was a laborer and a member of the Masons, the ancient secret society. Okay, I see. Who adherents believed in science and racial equality. Around 11 o'clock on that Monday night, a squad of police officers arrived at the Johnson's home with badges prominently displayed. A couple of detectives went around the house to cover the rear door. With guns drawn, detectives Pat Grant and Harry Wilson forced the front door and entered. The 29-year-old Wilson had just made detective 7 months earlier. He was married with an infant child. Now I'm trying to figure out why they went to their house, the Johnson's house, anyway. As the detectives reached the second floor, Wilson said to his boss, Pat, I am younger than you. Let me pass in front. Wilson entered the middle bedroom with another officer. There is nobody here, I don't believe, the officer said. Let me see, said Wilson, getting down on his hands and knees to search under the bed. A gunshot flared in the darkness, striking Wilson in the left breast, passing through his heart and coming out the right side of his chest. Under the bed, Wilson gasped. Under the bed. Other officers rushed into the living room, firing wildly. A woman screamed. More officers arrived with torches. They found Carrie Johnson crouched in the corner with a bullet wound in her thigh. Next to her lay a blue steel revolver, 3 chambers empty. Ben Johnson emerged from under the bed with a bullet wound in his shoulder. The burst of gunshots in the dark had stilled the fever of the white man. And several policemen carried Wilson out and laid him in a waiting patrol car that sped off, only to slam into a passing fire truck on Pennsylvania Avenue. The wounded officer was put into another car, but at the hospital, Wilson was declared dead on arrival. Ben and Carrie Johnson, bloodied but alive, were taken to a city jail. They didn't go to the hospital. Y'all didn't even. You took the officer. You took the officer to the hospital. Oh my God. Washington in 2019 is a city transformed. The corner at 7th and Florida, where black men gathered in self-defense 100 years ago, is today occupied by a CVS pharmacy. Howard University students gathered in an Afrocentric tea house while tours visit the renovated Howard Theater. 7 blocks away at 14th and U, a public history sign proclaimed "From Riot to Renaissance." And it's an upbeat civic tale referring not to the white riot of 1919, but to the black riot that followed the assassination of Reverend Martin Luther King Jr. in April 1968. That riot left the U Street corridor devastated for decades. But in the 1990s, the neighborhood began to revive with construction of a new municipal office building and the opening of the Metro's Green Line. And I'm trying to figure out why from 1968 to 1990 it took that long to revitalize that area. My God. So where all your tax money went? The money that they take from you black folks in your community, where you live and reside, is supposed to come back. So why did it, and they take hell of a taxes from us. I was thinking about doing a video talking about the disparities and how much taxes we pay. They take hell of a taxes from us. So why does it take so long for your communities to be rebuilt? That's what I'm saying. We're the watchdogs, black folks. We need to create our own watchdogs in our communities, and we need to hold these local leaders and national leaders accountable. Those who get paid, that's supposed to help and support our communities, and they don't. Just like what's happening in California. You heard how they was talking for the past few years about reparations in California, right? You see how quiet it got? But then you see how they so big, strong, and big mad with what's going on with these illegal immigrants, but they ain't talking about the reparations no more, right? We need to have our watchdogs. Come on. Y'all need to get up. Stop being complacent. Stop waiting for somebody else to speak up and do more than speak up. If you have to do petitions, if you have to threaten these people's futures and livelihoods, you know they don't want to be broke and poor, impoverished and homeless. So maybe some of them need to get a taste of their own medicine. Go after their pockets. I'm talking about these black leaders and politicians who are supposed to be helping us and they're not doing anything. And why is California so quiet when it comes to these California reparations? Okay. Violent race relations were nothing new to the nation's capital. Before the Civil War, Washington was home to one of the largest slave trading syndicates in the Upper South, with numerous Georgia pens for human chattel, including one in the Center Market at 7th and Pennsylvania. At the same time, the District of Columbia was a mecca for black achievers, a haven for black Americans who had been manumitted by slave owners and Virginia, or had otherwise escaped slavery as of 1830. A third of Washington's 30,000 residents were black, and more than half of them were legally free. In August 1835, black aspirations provoked a white backlash as abolitionists blanketed the Capitol with anti-slavery pamphlets. A young enslaved black man was arrested for attacking his white female owner with an axe. I told you, them slaves fought back. A mob of angry white men sought to lynch him, thwarted by Marines called in from the Navy Yard, and rioters spread out across the city. From Capitol Hill to Pennsylvania Avenue to Foggy Bottom, they attacked the homes, schools, and businesses of free black Americans. No one was unalive, but some of the most successful black residents departed for Canada, which welcomed free people of color. You see the mentality they have? Okay, the mentality of owning a whole flesh body is a trip in itself. But then when this person who still has a soul and a mind and a desire for freedom says, I'm tired and I don't want to live like a mangy dog anymore, and decides to defend themselves, look who get angry. They still do the same thing today. When black people get tired of being harassed by the police and they like, officer, will you tell me, look, I'm just getting off work. I'm tired. What did I do, officer? What did I do? Don't ask questions. Just get your black ass out the car. You know, and they just get tired. They get tired of being harassed. Working in sectors where they're harassed. You see why I keep saying it's amazing how black people just ain't broke? And I know why you haven't broke. Because what you have in you is too much. It'll be like 1 million nuclear bombs going off at once. In due time. Let's go on. After the Civil War and the founding of Howard University in 1867, Washington became the center of black education in the United States. In 1872, Frederick Douglass, the most famous black man in America, moved to a big house overlooking the Anacostia River. A black business class was emerging, exemplifying by hotelier James Wormley, whose downtown establishment was the site of negotiations that settled the disputed presidential election of 1876 between Republican Rutherford B. Hayes and Democrat Samuel J. Tilden. Decades later, oh my God, wait a minute. Isn't that the election where they ended up selling black folks out in the South? And they negotiated their terms at a black You see what I'm talking about? Boule? Okay, let's go on. Decades later, after President Woodrow Wilson asked Congress to declare war on Germany in April 1917, Americans, black and white, flocked to Washington in search of the many good jobs the war effort produced. The city's population burgeoned to 500,000, including 115,000 black Americans. Ben and Carrie Johnson might well have been part of the migration, moving to town sometime after the 1910 census from Gastonia, North Carolina, where Ben had joined the Masons and belonged to the Golden Rule Lodge. Washington's black newcomers gravitated to Southwest and to the U Street corridor, which was lined with shops and stores owned by black Americans. The True Reformer building at 12th and U Street's Northwest, where a young sign painter turned piano player named Duke Ellington sometimes performed, was home to the balls, concerts, and classes of black American high society. At 13th and T, the Whitelaw Hotel rose up 5 floors, the first black-owned, black-built apartment residence in the city. Today, The True Reformer building is still home to black social organizations. Other black newcomers rented houses along 7th Street Northwest, a popular commercial boulevard divided by an electric streetcar line. Many of the shopkeepers were black or Jewish immigrants from Eastern Europe. Dudley's Mid-City Theater at N Street boasted of being the only theater on 7th Street catering to colored people that does not discriminate. Dudley is long gone, so the streetcar on the block now stands a modern apartment building occupied by parishioners of the First Rising Mount Zion Baptist Church. In 1919, as in 2020, most black residents of the Capitol regarded the President of the United States as an affiliation. Upon taking office in 1913, Woodrow Wilson had ordered the segregation of races at the Treasury Department and the United States Post Office, where blacks and whites had worked side by side since the end of the Civil War. And I did a video on Woodrow Wilson called The Most Wickedest Man. Suddenly, men of color were forbidden to enter a room occupied by white clerks. The Treasury, Interior, and State Departments created separate lavatories for blacks and whites. And that's what I said about, I was reading a book saying that this discrimination thing or racist thing wouldn't have been so big and forceful against black folks if the government didn't condone it and initiate it. You know, if it was just regular private citizens doing this, it would have died out eventually. But you had the whole United States government creating discrimination and segregation. Crimes against humanity. That's why I keep saying I don't know why black folks ain't came up with no lawsuit against this government for years of aiding and abetting racists. The first draft of the history of Washington's 1919 race war was written by two newspapermen, Calvin Chase, Ned McLean. They had virtually nothing in common save their livelihood of selling broadsheet newspapers. Chase, 65, was the honorary editor and publisher of the Washington Bee. He came from a free black family that had lived in Washington for 3 generations. Educated at Howard University prep school, he skipped college and ventured into both law and journalism as a young man. 1880, he took over the Bee and for 41 years wrote caustic, civic-minded editorials about black rights and white racism. His motto for the Bee: honey for our friends and stings for our enemies. They done just got black America too complacent, man. They gave y'all these little jobs in corporate America or entertainment and, gave you millions of dollars here and hundreds of millions there. And it made you just sell out yourself. You just became complacent, really believing that it got better for you. But you're not being honest about how you're still treated. Let's go on, Jesus Christ. Ned McLean was half Chase's age. At about 30, he was the publisher of the Washington Post, a daily he had inherited upon his father's death in 1916, along with a vast fortune. Educated by private tutors, McLean likewise had not bothered to go to college. He didn't have to. He was, his father was rich. He didn't have to. And white. In 1908, he eloped to Europe with Evelyn Walsh, the daughter of a Colorado gold mine owner. Evelyn became famous in 1911 when she purchased a Hope diamond. She and her husband entertained with vulgar opulence on their 80-acre estate in Northwest Washington, now the site of the McLean Gardens residential complex on Wisconsin Avenue. In the summer of 1919, McLean sought to exploit the capital's crackling racial tensions. In circulation, the Post, a morning newspaper, ran a poor section to the Evening Star, the city's largest paper, which published in the afternoon. In an apparent battle for readers, the Post, along with the Star, the Washington Times, and the Washington Herald, played up rumors of white women being sexually assaulted by black men. On July the 9th, the D.C. branch of the NAACP sent letters to the editors of the Post and the other three dailies saying that their inflammatory headlines were sowing the seeds of a race riot. The Star acknowledged the justice of the complaint. The other newspapers ignored the warning. On July the 15th, the Post front page described an incident at an amusement park in Northeast where two black men allegedly pulled a gun on a white woman and assaulted her. The woman later recanted. 2 days later, the Washington Times on the evening paper carried this front page headline, "Another girl is attacked here." Police rounded up hundreds of black men, often far from the scene of the alleged crimes. "There is a reign of terror in this country," Chase wrote in the Bee. "The colored Americans have fought and died for this country are no more free today than they were prior to the War of the Rebellion. No matter how loyal he is to this country or what he has done and is doing, the law of oppression continues to exist and operate against him." I should read that over again because it seemed like some black folks think they really have arrived. Let's go on. Soon enough, the Pennsylvania Avenue sidewalk where today's tourists snapped selfies outside the Trump International Hotel was a comeback zone. And nearly every block, groups of white men and Negroes engaged in fistfights or more serious affrays in which clubs and knives were employed. The Post reported on the first day of rioting. The police were overwhelmed. As individual and group fights occurred every few minutes, they were able to do but little. In the White House, Wilson was growing alarmed. After a second day of chaos in the streets, the president summoned his Secretary of War, Newton Baker, and demanded that he restore order. Baker, a former mayor of Cleveland, was a no-nonsense administrator who did not entirely share his boss's racism. In the war effort, Baker had relied on black Americans' aides to keep him informed about the grievances and aspirations of black servicemen. Unlike Wilson, he had publicly saluted the black veterans returning from Europe. Now, see, God bless his soul. There are a few people who don't look like us that actually have a conscience. They do. Okay, let's go on. Baker wanted to call in federal troops from Fort Meade, but he could act only if D.C. Commissioner Louis Brownlow and Police Chief Raymond Pullen asked for help. Brownlow, a former journalist appointed by Wilson, refused, claiming the police had the situation under control. July 21 edition of the Post announced a mobilization of all able-bodied men at the Knights of Columbus headquarters on Pennsylvania Avenue between 7th and 8th Streets Northwest. That block is now occupied by a memorial plaza honoring the members of the U.S. Navy and the temple-like home of the National Archives. The mission: clean up the city. Mobs of white men accordingly reassembled on the downtown streets that morning. Calvin Chase described the scene outside his office. At the corner of 11th and I Streets Northwest, a mob of 300 assembled looking for colored citizens to come by in the cars. The site of the Bee's office is now a downtown pocket park surrounded by glassy office buildings. A few blocks away at 7th and G, a gang of white men tried to wrestle a black man from a passing streetcar. He pulled a gun and fired into the crowd, driving them back. Okay, I'm not even going to talk about that. I just want to say this, black folks. Those of you who have an issue with guns, you better get over it real quick. Or if you don't have a gun, you better have some stun guns. You better have you some mace. You better have you some pepper spray. You better have you some knives. You better have you something. A passing policeman shot him 7 times. You see that? The corner is now home to Capital One Arena, which opened as the MCI Center in 1997 and arguably sparked the DC gentrification boom. And y'all need to fight against that too, because that ain't nothing but racism. They took their wealth, they took all their resources and ran to suburbia. Now they want to move back because they realized they effed up. And then so they want to move back. They want to come stumping in like big giants. You better make them stomp out and stop letting them be so comfortable in your communities. Let's go on. But before long, blacks were given as well as they got. That night, the Post reported the Negroes began to take vengeance for the assaults on their race in the downtown districts the night before. When white rioters ventured into the U Street neighborhood, they were roughly handled. When white policemen sought to rescue rioters beaten or slashed by black fighters, the assailants disappeared. Panting detachments of detectives, policemen, and soldiers rushed from one scene to another, each time arriving too late, the Post reported. Up on U Street, armed and anxious, black men patrolled the streets on the lookout for white interlopers. Willie Marshall, a light-skinned black man, would tell his son, Thurgood, the future Supreme Court Justice, of his experience in the Washington race war. He was chased from white streets for being too black and from black streets for being too white. The rioters were repelled from Southwest even as they tormented blacks elsewhere. The colored population held its own in Southwest. Chase crowded in the editorial. Ethiopia resigned supreme in his section, but one exception. A colored woman was caught in a white neighborhood by 4 men who forced her to undress and walk out of the neighborhood naked. You nasty bastard. The Evening Star called it the most weird and wicked night in the history of the nation's capital. By the time it was over, Harry Wilson was unalive and Ben and Carrie Johnson were in jail. On July the 22nd, city officials caved to reality. Humiliated by the continuing chaos, Commissioner Brownlow accepted the Bakers' demand for federal intervention. The Secretary of War gave command authority to a U.S. Army general who put 1,000 more troops into the streets within hours. Even so, another night of mayhem ensued. Mobs and race class surged through streets, killing and maiming, reported the Post. Civil War times recalled by Wild Night's tumult. The paper's tally of the injured found that more whites than blacks were hurt in the last night of fighting. The black community had turned the tables. Only the federal troops and a torrential summer rainstorm finally dispersed the crowds and restored what historians Anne Hodgdorn dubbed a savage peace. What do you think it would be like today? So much has taken place since then. So much anger, hurt, disappointment, betrayal. I'll be telling these people, y'all don't want that. Y'all better leave black folks alone. If you know what's good for you, stop pushing people backs against the wall. You might get something you didn't expect. Let's go on. For Ned McLean and the editors of the Post, the news that a white policeman had been killed by a black American was sensational and tragic. The Washington Post describes 500 for popular fund for slain policemen, declared a headline in the news page. The fund said the Post would provide for the needs of those dependent for the support on members of the police force who sacrificed their lives. And what's so crazy is the Washington Post perpetuated it. They perpetuated the chaos. Whoa, but I bet you nothing happened to them. And suppressing the present outbreak of lawlessness. The first beneficiaries of McLean's charity were Wilson's widow and infant child. Calvin Chase barely blinked. Wilson had clashed with a crowd of black defenders early in the day, as if looking for trouble. The Bee regrets the death of Detective Wilson, Chase wrote in his next editorial. He can only blame himself. At the corner of 7th and Florida, he was vindicated toward the colored people. Did he have the right to invade the home of the person who shot him? Did he see a felony committed? Did he witness a murderous assault? That's what I was saying. That's what I was asking. Why did they burst into that man and young lady's home? What was your legal reason for doing that? Okay, let's continue. This is what the black editorial is saying. Editor is saying, if he did, he was justified in entering and his assailant should be punished. Chase went on. If not, he had no right to enter this home. No respectable colored person was safe upon the street. The whites started it, and the Bee regrets it. All honor to the white citizens who side with the law-abiding colored citizens. Black self-defense was a revelation for all concerned. On Capitol Hill, Congress was in an uproar. Rep. J.W. Ragsdale of South Carolina denounced the rioting as a communist conspiracy and then dropped dead the next day. The spectacle of armed black men impelled Congress to pass the district's strongest gun control law ever, requiring the registration. Oh my God. Okay, let me read this over again. The spectacle of armed black men impelled Congress to pass the district's strongest gun control law ever, requiring the registration of all guns with penalties for carrying firearms in public. That's exactly what they did in California. Because the Black Panther dared to show that they had a right to protect themselves and their communities, because they didn't want the police to come into their communities anymore because of violence, because of police brutality, and violence committed against black folks from police. They didn't want them in their communities more, so they armed themselves up and was determined to defend their communities, right? Until when they went and marched out there in Sacramento with their guns, white California politicians said, hell no, we ain't gonna let these black folks have guns with the history of what our people have done to them. Are you crazy? That's what it's all about. It's the fear. When they saw these black people protecting themselves, they was like, no the hell not. You see how many countries, you see how many black communities they went in and massacred, and a lot of the times that happened because black folks didn't have guns. How wicked do you have to be to go? Okay, we already know. Black Americans deeply resented the Post role in instigating the mobs. The local chapter of the NAACP wrote a letter to the Justice Department asking that the paper be charged with inciting a riot. The department responded that there were no grounds for action. The pain of the week-long carnage was mixed with pride. 5 black men have been unalived along with 4 whites. Hundreds of men and women have been arrested or suffered injuries. Many remain in jail, but the toll could have been much worse. In East St. Louis, 2 years earlier, white mobs had burned a black neighborhood, unaliving at least 40. In Chicago the following week, a white riot resulted in 38 deaths, 23 of them black. Nothing like that had happened in Washington, where the white attackers suffered a roughly equal number of fatalities and never pierced the black line of self-defense around U Street. Yes, it was stopped, shouted the front page headline in the Bee, which featured a cartoon of a white man beating a black man in front of the White House, while a policeman stood by and the goddess of justice wept. The Negroes saved themselves and saved Washington by their determination not to run but to fight. Fight in defense of their lives and their homes. Said Johnson of the NAACP, the Washington riot gave me the thrill that comes once in a lifetime. A Southern colored woman wrote in a letter published in the NAACP Crises magazine. At least our men had stood like men, struck back, were no longer dumb driven cattle. As she read about the riot, the woman said she wept tears of gladness and madness. The pent-up humiliation, grief, and horror of a long time, half a century, was being stripped from me. Carrie and Ben Johnson were both charged with first-degree murder. I don't understand how it's first degree, but they were held in the D.C. jail for the next 18 months as U.S. Attorney John Lasky and his prosecutors prepared for trial. No one could say for certain who had fired the shot that had killed Harry Wilson, but the weight of suspicion seemed to fall on Carrie. Her case would come up first. In the beginning, the black community rallied to the girl's defense. From jail, Ben hired a fellow Mason named William Hart to represent her in court. To reporters, Hart described Carrie as the little heroine and our Joan of Arc, or Charlotte Corday, a reference to the French revolutionary who assassinated Jacobean leader Jean-Paul Marat. Hart's dramatic account of the shooting differed from that given by the police and newspapers. Carrie Johnson faced death like a little rabbit in a corner, fired upon point blank by Officer Wilson and others, he said. The Pollyanna Club, a ladies group, sponsored a fashion show to pay Carrie's legal expenses and raised more than $1,300. The prosecutor based his theory on the case on one police officer's statement that, as Carrie was being escorted from the house, she had told him she had fired a fatal shot in fear. Carrie later denied saying any such thing. Meanwhile, Ben, facing the death penalty, apparently agreed to testify against his daughter. What? What the F? Oh, that's terrible. The prosecutor dropped the charges against him. In November 1920, he was released on $200 bond and listed as a witness for the government. God, I know she was sitting there like, Dad. As Carrie Johnson's trial finally neared, she could hardly have been more alone. She had been reviled in the press. One headline about Wilson's death proclaimed that he had died while arresting a rioting negress. Her father had gone free. Attorney Hart had vanished for reasons unknown. The Pollyanna Club's money was gone. No newspaper reporter interviewed her. There was no photograph of her. In the eyes of the law and of white America, she barely existed. Only a few sympathizers rallied to her side. The Reverend William Jerrigan, a Baptist preacher and president of the National Race Congress, a civil rights group, came to her defense. So did Benjamin Gaskin, a veteran Washington attorney from an elite African American family of doctors, lawyers, and professionals. He took over her case before the trial began. In July 1921, a jury of 12 white men heard the case. Wasn't she supposed to have a jury of her peers? God, oh my God. Carrie Johnson, murder in the first degree, with Judge Ashley Gould presiding. The government called a dozen police officers to testify. Ben Johnson, it seemed, did not testify. I guess somebody got to his ass. Like, dude, you gonna do this? You gonna really testify against your daughter? Ooh, you spineless. The decisive moment came when Gaskin argued that Carrie had acted in self-defense. Assistant U.S. Attorney Lucius Vander Gelb objected. The girl had nothing to fear from the armed men invading her home, he said. In a corner of a dark room, back of a bed, the defendant occupied a position of comparative safety, the prosecutor explained. It can hardly be seriously contended that there was anything in the language or conduct of the four detectives in the room, or before they had entered it, to engender the mind of the defendant a reasonable belief that she was in imminent danger. The judge upheld the government's position. Gaskin was not allowed to argue self-defense. Here's the thing. There was a riot happening. A brutal, barbaric, violent riot happening. And, okay, let's go on. After all the witnesses had testified, the prosecutor pulled one last trick. In the presence of the jury, Vander Gelb announced that the government had dropped the murder charges against Ben Johnson. It was inappropriate to mention under the case in front of the jury, but it left the clear implications that if the father hadn't committed the crime, the daughter must have. Gaskins objected and was overruled. You know, they say justice is blind, right? After a brief deliberation, the jurors convicted Carrie, but not for first-degree murder. In an unusual move, the choice to return a verdict of manslaughter, not a capital crime, suggesting that even the white male jurors had a degree of sympathy for her. Gaskin asked for bail. The judge set the bond at $5,000. About $75,000 today, which the Reverend Jorgen promptly put up. At a hearing in June 1921, Gaskin moved for a new trial. He cited 14 points of law, echoing, perhaps intentionally, President Wilson's famous 14 points, the principle for a new world order. Frederick Sidian's Associate Justice on the Supreme Court of the District of Columbia was persuaded. He allowed Gaskin's argument that Carrie had merely acted in self-defense and terror and ordered a new trial. The government's weak case was getting weaker. If Gaskin could argue self-defense, another jury might not even convict for manslaughter. Carrie might well be acquitted. Rather than risk the possibility of losing in court, the U.S. attorney dropped the charges. On June 21, 1921, the Post buried a tiny story on the inside page, released in riot killing. Carrie Johnson colored, freed, and death of Detective Wilson. Carrie Johnson's release quietly vindicated Calvin Chase's conviction that self-defense in the face of mob violence was no crime. By then, however, Chase was deceased. He had died at his desk 7 days before the start of the Carrie's trial. Some 3,000 people, black and white, attended his funeral. So Calvin Chase was the editor, the black editor of the, I think he was the owner too, or the editor of the black newspaper. We shall read no more than formative editorials of his trenchant pen, said one eulogist, but he leaves a blessed heritage, not only for his family, but for his race. The Bee ceased publication a year later. Ned McLean was slowly running the Washington Post into the ground and ruining himself. Evelyn McLean found his drinking insane. The marriage broke up and the newspaper went bankrupt because y'all did what y'all did was evil. Y'all caused people lives to be taken. You caused harm and destruction because of a lie. You never win when it comes. I'm telling you, I don't care how much you think a lie will save you. In the end, you're going to find out that it destroyed you and it's eating you up from the inside out. In 1933, the Post would be auctioned off to financier Eugene Meyer, who built it into a serious newspaper that developed an editorial voice on civil rights issues rather closer to Calvin Chase than to Ned McLean's. Harry Wilson is remembered in the National Law Enforcement Officers Memorial in Judiciary Square, a few blocks from where he was shot in July 1919. The memory of Carrie Johnson, however, is vanishingly faint. A 1922 city directory indicates that she had a job as a janitor. In 1930, her name did not appear on the census or in the census. She might have gotten married, moved away, or died. Ben Johnson was no longer listed either. And he was a Mason. Ben Johnson was a Mason, and he was agreed to send his daughter up the river. Okay, so I'm going to just end by saying, seeing that all the, the horrific things that we as a people have endured in this country, and we're still here, we're still present, we're still prevalent, we still stand our ground strong and bold. Other groups, don't you dare open your mouth and ask us for help again, because where was you when we went through decades and decades and decades after slavery, dealing with injustices? Where were you? Oh, I remember. You was on the sideline with the racists, condoning it, telling us to shut up and stop complaining. So remember that next time you want to fix your mouth and ask us for help. All right, folks, thank you for your support. And those who listen to the whole video to the end, thank you so much. Thank you for liking, commenting, sharing, and it helps a lot, folks. It does. Have a great weekend. I'm out.